The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Mason Tucker rode his black stallion along the dusty trail toward the small settlement of Copper Ridge. He was a man who preferred solitude, carrying the kind of quiet strength that came from years of frontier living and the wisdom that followed hard experience. The sound that made him rein in his horse was barely audible over the desert wind, a child's voice, small and frightened, coming from behind a cluster of rocks near an abandoned mining claim. "Please don't hit me again," the voice whispered, thick with tears and terror. Mason dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip as he approached the source of the plea. What he found around the rocks made his blood run cold with rage. A boy, no more than 10 years old, crouched against a boulder with his arms raised protectively over his head. His clothes were little more than rags, his face was streaked with dirt and tears, and Mason could see fresh bruises on his thin arms. Standing over the child was a large man in expensive clothes, his fist raised to deliver another blow. Well, the man sneered, noticing Mason's approach. "Looks like we have company, boy. Maybe this stranger wants to see what happens to thieves." The child looked up at Mason with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "I wasn't stealing, mister," he said in a voice that shook with fear. "I was just looking for water." Mason studied the scene, taking in the expensive clothes and soft hands of the man doing the beating, contrasted with the obvious poverty and desperation of the child. His jaw tightened as he recognized the type, someone who used his wealth and size to terrorize those who couldn't fight back. "That's far enough," Mason said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made smart men reconsider their actions. The large man, who introduced himself as Silas Blackwood, laughed dismissively. "This is none of your concern, stranger. This boy is a thief and a vagrant, and he's getting exactly what he deserves." "What did he steal?" Mason asked, his voice remaining calm, despite the anger building in his chest. "Water from my well," Blackwood replied, "and food from my property." Mason looked down at the boy, who couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds soaking wet, then back at Blackwood, who clearly enjoyed meals regularly and wore clothes that cost more than most people earned in a year. "How much water?" Mason asked. "That's not the point," Blackwood snapped. "Theft is theft. A cup, a bucket. How much water did this child steal?" The boy spoke up in a whisper. "I just cupped some in my hands, sir. I've been walking for 2 days without water." Mason felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. He'd seen men beaten for stealing horses or cattle, for crimes that actually harmed others. But this was a child being brutalized for drinking enough water to stay alive. "Mr. Blackwood," Mason said, his voice taking on an edge that made the larger man step back slightly. "I suggest you walk away from this boy. Now." "Who do you think you are?" Blackwood demanded, though he lowered his fist. "You can't tell me what to do with trespassers on my property." "I'm someone who doesn't like seeing children beaten by grown men," Mason replied simply, "and I'm someone who's willing to do something about it." The threat in Mason's voice was unmistakable, and Blackwood, despite his size advantage, seemed to recognize that he was facing someone far more dangerous than a hungry child. "This isn't over," Blackwood muttered, backing toward his horse. "That boy is trouble, and anyone who helps him will regret it." As Blackwood rode away, Mason knelt down beside the boy, who was still trembling with fear and exhaustion. "What's your name, son?" Mason asked gently. "Tommy," the boy whispered. "Tommy Henderson." "Well, Tommy Henderson, when's the last time you had a proper meal?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember, sir. Maybe a week ago." Mason felt his heart clench at the simple, heartbreaking honesty of the answer. This wasn't just a case of a child getting into mischief. This was a child fighting for survival. "Where are your parents, Tommy?" "Dead, sir. Fever took them both last winter. I've been trying to make it to my aunt in Tucson, but I got lost, and I ran out of food." And Tommy's voice broke completely. Mason looked at this small, brave boy who'd been walking alone across the Arizona desert, trying to reach family, and felt something shift inside his chest. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, keeping his life simple and solitary. But sometimes, life presented you with choices that defined who you really were. "Tommy," Mason said softly. "How would you like to come with me? I've got food, water, and a safe place to sleep. And I promise you, nobody's going to hit you again." Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe how this act of kindness changes both their lives. Tommy looked up at Mason with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You mean it, mister? You'd really help me?" "I mean it," Mason replied firmly. "My name's Mason Tucker, and I give you my word that as long as you're with me, you'll be safe." As Mason helped Tommy onto his horse and wrapped him in a spare blanket, both of them understood that this chance encounter had changed the trajectory of their lives. Mason had found a purpose he hadn't known he was looking for, and Tommy had found the protection and care he'd been desperately seeking. But neither of them realized that Silas Blackwood's parting threat had been more than just angry words. The man who'd been beating a child for drinking water had connections and influence throughout the territory, and he didn't take well to being challenged by strangers. The ride to Mason's ranch would be the beginning of a bond that would be tested by danger, strengthened by trust, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose to protect, regardless of blood or law. 2 weeks had passed since Mason Tucker had rescued Tommy Henderson from Silas Blackwood's brutality, and the transformation in the boy was remarkable. Regular meals had put some meat on his bones, clean clothes had restored his dignity, and most importantly, the constant fear had begun to fade from his eyes. Mason's ranch was a modest but well-maintained operation in a valley protected by red rock formations. It wasn't large, but it was self-sufficient, with a small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden, and a cabin that felt more like home than anywhere Tommy had ever lived. "Mr. Tucker," Tommy said one morning as they worked together mending fence, "why did you help me that day? Most folks just rode past when they saw me on the trail." Mason paused in his work, considering how to answer the boy's question honestly, without revealing too much of his own painful past. "Sometimes, Tommy, life gives you a chance to do the right thing, not the easy thing, not the profitable thing, just the right thing. When I saw that man hurting you, I had to choose what kind of person I wanted to be. But you didn't even know me." Tommy persisted with the relentless logic that children possessed. "Didn't matter," Mason replied. "You needed help, and I was in a position to give it. That's enough." Tommy absorbed this philosophy while continuing to work, his small hands surprisingly capable with the fence wire. In 2 weeks, he'd proven to be intelligent, hardworking, and eager to learn everything Mason could teach him about ranch life. "Mr. Tucker," Tommy said eventually, "what's going to happen to me? I mean, when you get tired of having me around." The question hit Mason harder than he'd expected. In 2 weeks, the boy had become such an integral part of his daily routine that he'd stopped thinking of the arrangement as temporary. "Tommy," Mason said carefully, "how would you feel about staying here permanently, not as a visitor or someone I'm helping temporarily, but as well as my son?" Tommy's eyes widened with an expression of hope so intense it was almost painful to witness. "You mean adopt me? Legal and everything, Mason confirmed. "If that's what you want." Tommy's response was to drop his tools and throw his arms around Mason's waist in a hug that conveyed more gratitude than words ever could. But their moment of happiness was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Mason counted at least 6 riders coming up the valley trail, and something about their purposeful approach made him instinctively move Tommy behind him. "Stay close to me," Mason said quietly, recognizing Silas Blackwood at the head of the group. Blackwood rode up with 5 other men, all of them armed and wearing the expressions of people who'd come looking for trouble. "Well, Tucker," Blackwood called out, not bothering to dismount, "I told you that helping that boy would be a mistake. What do you want, Blackwood?" Mason replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "I want justice," Blackwood replied. "That boy stole from me, and harboring a thief makes you an accessory to his crimes." The boy took a drink of water. Mason said evenly, "Hardly a hanging offense. Theft is theft," Blackwood insisted. "And I've brought the territorial sheriff to settle this matter legally." One of the riders, wearing a badge, urged his horse forward. Sheriff Morrison was a thin, nervous man who clearly wished he were anywhere else. Mr. Tucker, Morrison said reluctantly. Mr. Blackwood has filed a complaint alleging that you're harboring a fugitive. I'm going to need to take the boy in for questioning. Mason felt Tommy press closer against his back, and the child's fear rekindled the protective fury that had first made him intervene. Sheriff, Mason said calmly, are you really planning to arrest a 10-year-old boy for drinking water? Now see here. Blackwood interjected, this isn't just about water. The boy has been seen near several properties where livestock have gone missing. He's probably part of a larger rustling operation. Tommy spoke up from behind Mason, his voice small but clear. I never stole any animals, sir. I don't even know how to steal animals. Subscribe to our channel now. The confrontation that's about to unfold will test everything Mason stands for. Mason studied the faces of the men arrayed against them and realized this wasn't really about theft or justice. This was about Silas Blackwood's wounded pride and his need to reassert dominance over anyone who dared to challenge him. Sheriff Morrison, Mason said quietly, you've known me for 5 years. Have I ever given you reason to think I'd harbor criminals or support theft? Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. No, Mr. Tucker, you haven't. But Mr. Blackwood is a prominent citizen, and when he makes a complaint, he gets special treatment, Mason finished, even when that complaint involves brutalizing a child. I never brutalized anyone, Blackwood snapped. I was disciplining a thief, which is my right as a property owner. You're right. Mason's voice took on a dangerous edge. You think wealth gives you the right to beat children? The tension in the group was becoming explosive, and Sheriff Morrison seemed to realize that he was caught between two forces that could easily turn violent. Mr. Tucker, Morrison said carefully, if you could just let me question the boy, maybe we can sort this out peacefully. Mason looked down at Tommy, who was trying to be brave but clearly terrified at the prospect of being taken away from the first safety he'd known in months. Tommy, Mason said gently, do you trust me? Yes, sir, Tommy replied without hesitation. Then trust me now, Mason said. Sheriff Morrison, you can question Tommy right here, with me present, but nobody is taking this boy anywhere. The standoff that followed seemed to stretch forever, 6 armed men facing 1 man and a child, with justice hanging in the balance. But Mason Tucker had faced down worse odds before, and he'd learned that sometimes standing for what's right required risking everything you had. The question was whether Sheriff Morrison had enough integrity to do his job fairly, or whether Silas Blackwood's influence would prove stronger than the law. The questioning that followed revealed more about Silas Blackwood's character than it did about any crimes Tommy might have committed. Under Sheriff Morrison's reluctant interrogation, it became clear that every accusation against the boy was based on speculation, prejudice, and Blackwood's desire to justify his earlier violence. So you're saying this child, who weighs maybe 60 pounds and has been walking alone for weeks, somehow managed to steal cattle? Mason asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. Rustlers used children as scouts, Blackwood insisted. The boy could have been marking targets for a larger operation. Tommy looked up at Mason with confusion. Mr. Tucker, what's a scout? The innocent question undermined Blackwood's theory so thoroughly that even Sheriff Morrison seemed embarrassed by the accusation. Mr. Blackwood, Morrison said carefully, do you have any actual evidence that this child was involved in rustling? Witnesses, missing livestock from the specific time he was in the area, anything concrete? Blackwood's face reddened as he realized his accusations were falling apart under scrutiny. The evidence is that he was trespassing and stealing water. That alone justifies nothing, Mason interrupted firmly. That justifies nothing except maybe asking him to leave your property. It certainly doesn't justify beating a child. I have the right to protect my property, Blackwood snapped. From a thirsty 10-year-old? Mason's voice carried a contempt that made several of Blackwood's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. Sheriff Morrison seemed to come to a decision. Mr. Blackwood, unless you can provide actual evidence of a crime, I'm not going to arrest this child for drinking water, and if I hear reports of you laying hands on him again, you'll what? Blackwood demanded. I'm a tax-paying citizen of this territory, and I deserve protection from vagrants and thieves. You deserve the same protection as everyone else." Morrison replied with more backbone than he'd shown all day. No more, no less. But Mason could see that Blackwood wasn't finished. The man's pride had been wounded too deeply, and his need to reassert dominance was driving him toward increasingly desperate measures. "Fine," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a different tone. "If the law won't protect me, I'll protect myself. Tucker, you've got 24 hours to get that boy off my land." "We're not on your land," Mason pointed out. "We're on mine." "Your land borders mine," Blackwood replied with a cold smile. "And I'm claiming right of hot pursuit. That boy committed crimes on my property, and I have the right to recover stolen goods." "What stolen goods?" Mason demanded. "The water he stole, plus damages for trespassing, and the time I've spent dealing with this matter. I calculate the value at $50. It was a transparent attempt to create a legal pretext for harassment, but Mason realized that in a territory where wealthy men often bought their own version of justice, even ridiculous claims could be dangerous. "And if I refuse to pay your imaginary damages," Mason asked, "then I'll exercise my rights as a property owner to protect my interests," Blackwood replied, his meaning unmistakable. Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mr. Blackwood, you can't just what, Sheriff? Can't protect my property? Can't seek restitution for damages? I think you'll find that territorial law is quite clear on the rights of property owners." Mason realized that they'd reached the moment he'd been dreading since Blackwood's arrival. The man was essentially declaring war, using the boy as an excuse to settle a grudge that had nothing to do with water or cattle. "Tommy," Mason said quietly, not taking his eyes off Blackwood, "go inside the house and stay away from the windows." "But Mr. Tucker, now, son, subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe the courage this man shows protecting an innocent child." As Tommy reluctantly headed for the cabin, Mason turned his full attention to the 6 armed men facing him. The odds were bad, but he'd faced worse situations during his years as a cavalry scout, and he'd learned that sometimes moral authority could be as powerful as firepower. "Blackwood," Mason said quietly, "you came here looking for a fight because I embarrassed you in front of a child. Everything else is just window dressing on your wounded pride. I came here seeking justice." Blackwood replied, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what his real motivations were. "No, you came here seeking revenge, and you're using a 10-year-old orphan as your excuse." Mason's accusation hit close enough to home that several of Blackwood's men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Whatever they'd been told about the purpose of this visit, seeing the reality of the situation was clearly making some of them question their employers' motives. "The boy is a thief," Blackwood insisted, but with less conviction than before. "The boy is an orphan who was dying of thirst," Mason corrected. "And any man who would beat a child for trying to stay alive isn't fit to own property, let alone talk about justice." The silence that followed was broken by one of Blackwood's men, a grizzled cowboy who'd been watching the proceedings with growing disgust. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said, "I hired on to work cattle, not to threaten children. If this is what you're paying me for, I'll take my wages and ride on." "Me too," said another of Blackwood's men. "This ain't right." Within minutes, 4 of Blackwood's 6 men had decided they wanted no part in whatever their employer was planning. Only Blackwood himself and one other man, a hard-looking gunfighter named Crenshaw, remained committed to the confrontation. Sheriff Morrison looked relieved at the turn of events. "Mr. Blackwood, it seems your men have more sense than you do. I suggest you follow their example and ride on out of here." But Blackwood's pride wouldn't let him back down, especially not in front of witnesses who would spread the story throughout the territory. "This isn't over, Tucker," he said, wheeling his horse around. "Nobody humiliates Silas Blackwood and walks away unscathed." As the 2 remaining men rode away, Mason felt no sense of victory. Men like Blackwood didn't give up easily, and their next move would likely be more dangerous than a public confrontation. "Mr. Tucker," Sheriff Morrison said, "you might want to be extra careful for the next few weeks. Blackwood's got more pride than sense, and he's not likely to let this go." "I'll be ready," Mason replied. That evening, as Mason and Tommy sat on the porch watching the sunset, the boy asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. Mr. Tucker, are we going to be safe? Mason looked at the child he'd already begun to think of as his son and made a promise he intended to keep regardless of the cost. Tommy, as long as I'm breathing, nobody's going to hurt you. That's a promise. 6 months later, Mason Tucker and Tommy Henderson stood in the courthouse in Tucson, where a judge made their family official through legal adoption. Silas Blackwood had eventually given up his campaign of harassment after facing social ostracism from decent people throughout the territory who'd learned the truth about his behavior. The story had spread, as frontier stories do, and Blackwood found that his reputation for beating children had cost him far more than his wounded pride was worth. He'd eventually sold his properties and moved back east, where his past was unknown. Are you ready to be Tommy Tucker? Mason asked as they left the courthouse. I've been ready since the day you saved me. Tommy replied with the wisdom that hardship had given him. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of courage, protection, and chosen family from the American frontier. Hit that subscribe button now, because these tales prove that real strength comes from protecting those who can't protect themselves. As they rode back to their ranch, both father and son understood that family wasn't just about blood or legal documents. It was about the choice to stand up for each other, to provide protection and love, and to keep promises even when keeping them was dangerous. The stranger on horseback had dismounted slowly that day, but he'd stood up quickly when it mattered most, proving that sometimes the most important thing a man can do is simply refuse to let evil triumph over innocence. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these incredible tales of frontier justice and family bonds to life. Subscribe now and join us for more amazing stories that prove anyone can be a hero when they choose to do what's right.